I invite you to ask some questions of our Lucas. Yes, Lucas from UNSW, another interesting law school that has one of the world's absolute experts on climate change displacement, Jane McAdam. She heads up the Caldor Centre, and I use her book to teach from. So, good. Yes, Lucas.
It's not so much the protection of, well, it is, part of it is that precisely what you were talking about, the protection of this right to be distinctive and to have a certain distinctiveness. But then beyond that, and I think that's where the cookie crumbles, it's what happens when that distinctiveness encounters with a different distinctiveness, right? So it's in that moment of dialogue between you and the other that diversity is really tested. So I'm just kind of curious to see how that engagement with the other happens through the legal education model that you have in your law schools, and what do you see as kind of the gold standard, which probably is your own law schools, but
I'll go first if you like. So as I said in relation to our university, the Act of Parliament that created us says that we're to teach in a context of Catholic faith and values. So what that means is that staff who come and work with us and students who come and work with us understand that's the context in which we're teaching. But that doesn't mean that we impose anything. We might propose something, that's what we might say. And so we would say that we would have a fuller discussion about a range of issues than you might experience elsewhere, because we won't shy away from talking about the Catholic position on those sorts of contentious issues that I mentioned before. That doesn't mean that everyone in the class is on board with that project, not at all. So we have full and frank discussions in our classes. A lot of people who come to Notre Dame, people come to Notre Dame for a wide range of different reasons. Some come because we have small classes. So we heard Newcastle is a small law school. We're about half the size of that. So we take about 100 students a year. That enables us to teach in seminars with an average class size of 31 and to interact with the students. So the students get to know where we're coming from and we get to know where they're coming from. And it's a very respectful dialogue, which is not the sort of dialogue that you get in the general community. And it's actually quite a difficult task to do what I was talking about doing in our culture at the moment, because for some reason our culture is becoming more and more divided, and so people aren't actually interested in hearing what other people have to say, and people are easily offended by even propositions with which they disagree, as though that's just to state the proposition is somehow offensive. So it's a big challenge for us, as it is for everybody. But what we try to build over time in those small classes, and because we're able to develop relationships with the students, is to break down that kind of thinking and actually enable people to have a proper intellectual discussion about issues.
Tania, did you want to say something?
I'm happy to comment on that as well. It's an interesting thing about class sizes, and I do agree small classes are actually critical to be able to have good dialogue. And we no longer have lectures, we only have classes, so our lectures are now all online and our classes are face-to-face, and so we have small group classes, and they become quite small when, of course, students do clinical work where normally you wouldn't have more than 8 students per solicitor, and we have a whole legal clinic with solicitors that works there. I think some of the challenges for us in first year, and we spend quite a lot of time on first year experience, is around shaping, I think, different ways of thinking around law and also community. And so each year we, I think, try and do things that are a little bit different. This year we've had a significant focus on art, because we had a large-scale art exhibition where artists interpreted our five of our major public interest cases in very graphic and telling detail in an exhibition that was on for 3 months at the Lockup in Newcastle, which featured, exhibitions in the padded cell that's there, as well as some extraordinary art that I think was very confronting for students. I think that these sorts of experience, and certainly their reflective journals, have showed us, in any event, that it promotes diversity of thinking in terms of who they are and the privilege that they often have and also the luxury, if you like, of going to university, which is important. But it also, I think, causes students to think about things from the perspective of another person, which is something that we hope that we can build on all the way through as part of their law school experience.
I am Abbas Alvi from Indian Christian Society. I have questions from both of you, actually. It's very good to take the name like Catholic University and maybe Islamic University, Jewish universities, because they're definitely, certainly significant, some religious word, and probably it may be good. But with considering the diversity and all the other things now, are we really doing on the same pattern of the things or not? That's one part. And secondly, what is the law says now? Any university can come into any religious name like this? Is it allowed as on today? In Australia, that university can be like Muslim university or Jewish university or Buddhist university or something like that. How you feel like that politically? That's a question to you. And I can ask a straight question to you that in one of the slides you mentioned 8% intake of the indigenous community. And probably fifth or sixth slide indicates 1% they are passing out. So I couldn't understand that. Is 7% remaining who are not able to finish?
I can answer that. It's only 1% coming out in Australia, and most of them are coming out of our university.
Okay, but are you?
But it's overall, of that overall number, most of them are coming from Newcastle. Our attrition rate is about 10% in our Indigenous students, maybe 15% again, depending on which cohort you look at. So we're very proud of both statistics.
Great. Yeah. Great, thanks.
I think to answer your question, there'd be no bar to another religious tradition seeking to establish the university, other than all of the costs and paraphernalia and difficulties of establishing a university. Personally, I think that it may be less likely and less easy to do what was done when Notre Dame was established in 1989, where, as I said, the Act of Parliament actually enshrines that religious aspect to the university. Mind you, I'm sure there will be more that will try. There are a number of Christian colleges that are looking in the longer term that I know of to establish law schools and ultimately become universities. But that's a long-term project, and will be interesting to see what happens in relation to that. But just one other thing in relation to the different religious traditions in Australia. That's one of the really lovely things about Notre Dame. As I said before, some students are attracted to Notre Dame because of its small size and the way that we teach and access to legal professionals and all of those sorts of things. But others are attracted to Notre Dame because they're religious people. And that's not just people from the Catholic tradition, that's people from all religious traditions. And we actually find, it won't surprise Mary probably, that the students who come from the Islamic tradition are most enthusiastic about the religious aspects of the university, and probably more so. Most often more so than those who've come from the Catholic tradition.
Could I just add in there that to produce lawyers, a law school has to teach a certain number of designated subjects. I think there are 11. They're called the priestly 11 subjects, ironically. Irony.
Plus statutory interpretation.
Plus statutory interpretation, yes. So they're regarded as the core, named after Justice... What's his first name?
Priestley.
What's his first name? He's retired. Ironically, also he's Catholic. Used to go to our church, but a lovely man. And apart from that, you can do what you like. So, in other words, you can only call yourself a law school if you teach the 11 subjects, which are then mandated if your graduates are going to become admitted as lawyers. Generally, you've got to do something on top of that as well. But very good. Mary?
I'm Mary Carris from the Ethnic Communities Council of New South Wales, and I guess the question's probably for both of you to consider in terms of the cultural diversity that we have and the future of our multiculturalism, And how responsive are the universities, and particularly your two, but the other universities as well, in terms of the cultural competencies that your lecturers and your teachers have, that you mentioned earlier, that may be now faced with young people who are coming through the law school that are practising and have certain cultural traditions that may or may not be challenging through the law that we have today. So I just wondered what your observations and comments
I
regarding that.
think that's such a great question. I think about half of our law school staff are in fact from overseas, so it's quite a high proportion. And so we have staff from Brazil, I'm just trying to remember all of them, Canada, North America, from Europe, China, from a range of different countries, which I think does help because many of them have experienced quite a bit in terms of their arrival in Australia, and I think they're able to understand what the experience might be for new arrivals and even those who've been longer and may be facing particular issues. We have, though, been talking, I think, a great deal about having more embedded training on unconscious bias and implicit bias within the law school. We do quite a bit of work in the clinical area, but not enough, I think, in terms of our staff more generally, and it's certainly on my agenda. This year there's been a big focus, and every student across the whole university has to do mandatory training before they start university on consent and on sexual harassment and sexual issues. And so at the moment there's a heavy focus in that area for students, but I would like to also think that we would move towards thinking about bias training across the board for students as well as staff. But it is an area that I'm concerned about. And I'm concerned about it because of the demographics of the community that we live in and just the capacity of people to be able to respond and properly understand it. I must say we had our school assessment board meeting yesterday, and so for every student that's struggling, we have a conversation about why they're struggling and what supports they might need. And I think that's a very interesting conversation for staff to have, particularly when there are perspectives about students who may have come from other cultural backgrounds and who are struggling in part because of their difficulty in terms of grappling with the curriculum, but also in terms of a different lifestyle and the particular hurdles they might face, as well as potentially family overseas who are requiring attention.
Yeah, it is a great question and a real difficulty, and I think it's a problem that Australia is not really grappling with, but should be grappling with at the moment. And in particular, the incredible ignorance about religious beliefs that exists in our society throughout the professions, but particularly in the professions, but also throughout our society. So people do have an expectation that everybody else shares their worldview when everybody else doesn't share their worldview. And they don't, and some people don't make any attempt to try to understand where other people are coming from. It's impossible for a university to be all things to all people. And one of the things Glenn Davis says, which I agree with, is, and I think we've seen two diverse law schools here, is it's important that law schools are different and in some respects that they stick to their knitting, that they deal with what they're most expert at. But I think the problem of everybody getting to understand where each other is coming from is a manifest problem that we're really not addressing in this country. I mean, we can pretend that we're multicultural and everybody gets along, and on a surface level that's true, but in a lot of deep issues, like those life issues I mentioned in that talk, people are coming from completely different perspectives on those things, and there seems to be a great failing for people to even attempt to understand where each other is coming from.
I might just make one more comment about something that we've been working on but haven't fully developed yet, and that is that the issues of the lack of multicultural diversity within the community, I thought was so extensive. We started to do some work on developing an avatar, and the avatar was basically that a clinical teacher could sit in another room and their voice would change, a male could become a female, their makeup, their, whether they were veiled or whatever, could change. And it was really about testing assumptions and around bias, but we haven't yet fully emerged from that. But it was great. It's a great idea because essentially you can have the the lecturer responding in real time and you know, talking to the student about a difficult clinical legal issue, and then have that student response happening in the other room. So it'll be fascinating to see if we can develop it. We've got a fairly good technology department, so I'm interested to see whether we can. Yeah.
Tania?
Yes.
Hi, Trish Jenkins, United Nations Association of Australia.
Yep.
You talked before about the Indigenous Australian students. Do you have any programs that work with organisations that help Nurture students or Pitt students that you think that can move into your courses?
At the moment we've reached out to many of the people within our region, so all the local schools have information, and we work with Indigenous teachers. Our Wallatuka Institute, which is a central part of the university, and we have a PVC Indigenous, and we have a whole stream of leadership in the Indigenous area. They also help us, I think, understand. So when we interview Indigenous students, because we do it by way of interview and indicative exam results, as well as finding out a bit more of them, I interview the Indigenous students together with a staff member and together with an Indigenous member from the Wallatuka Institute. One issue that we've had is that for some people it's quite hard to prove that they're an Indigenous person, and so we've done a lot of work through the Wallatuka Institute making sure that that can be done in each town. I mean, it can be quite complex, and we want to make sure that it's done in a culturally appropriate way as well.
Yeah, right.
Plays a major part in their role.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. We've only got time for one more question, so I
Thank
ask
you.
Yes.
June Wang from Western Sydney Law School. I have a question for all three panelists. And in last 20 years, we have seen great progress in diversity in legal profession and judicial appointments. We have more women now, we have some women now at least, although still a big gap. And my question is, but however, as what I can say, we still don't have enough diversity in the racial and religious background, in particularly in judicial appointments. I just wondering, what do you think is the reason? Could be, you know, groups such as Asian, they are shy, they don't put their hands up, or could be, is there still a relatively closed club in judicial appointments? That's why we don't have enough diversity for Muslim background or Asian background people. Thank you.
Good.
I can start by answering that.
Yeah.
I think that is something that will take some time to change, but I think it's largely driven by the fact that to become a judge tends to take quite some time, and historically our legal profession came from a particular part of our society, and our society has changed very quickly. We need to remember that. So over time that will change. But we also have the difficulty that doing well in a law degree does have a lot to do with English proficiency, English expression, English grammar, English writing, English speaking. So people who are proficient at that are people who are likely to be higher achievers more quickly. But over time, I'm sure this will change. We'll see that there will definitely be more women in the higher echelons, and there already are. But that will continue to happen because in our law school, there's more than 70% of our students are female, and our highest achieving students are 99% female. So it's a very marked and obvious difference.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think part of that also, part of that relates to the way in which law firms operate, and that situation is not improving anytime soon. Law firms really operate on a Darwinian kind of principle of survival of the fittest, and everybody works extremely hard. That's not to say women don't work extremely hard, they certainly do. But I think generally speaking, women are much smarter than men, and they realise more quickly that this isn't really a great lifestyle. And obviously women have children, so men aren't blessed with that opportunity, so we don't get to do that. But women get to have children, and that impacts on their progress. Different firms are taking different positions about that, so some are trying to change the balance by treating women who are coming back from having children as if they've been in the firm for all that time when they haven't, and putting them at a higher level than, put them in the level that they would have been had they not had children. But these are difficult questions.
I've got a comment unless Mary wants to go next, or
No, look, I'm just here to moderate. But, yeah,
I think
I
it's
have
for
obviously
all three
strong
of us.
views on this too.
It's a very interesting question because most judges are, of course, drawn from the ranks of senior barristers, and that remains the case despite some notable exceptions over the last decade. And in terms of who's at the bar, I think that's a very interesting question about who's at the bar, who's not at the bar, and who's actually being briefed. And of course, in relation to women, there have been moves over, again, probably 5 years, to look at equitable briefing policies. But I think in terms of Asian Australians, if you wanted to look at that particular group, you would not see a representation that resembled what is currently in law schools at the bar. And so you have to ask questions around why is it that some people are not choosing a career at the bar. And I think that's quite interesting. It's interesting in terms of why women might not choose that career, and also why Asian Australians might not choose that career. But again, I think that there are some real hurdles and obstacles at the bar for different groups, and in terms of certainly the briefing arrangements that operate across Australia, and how government briefs and how private organisations brief, and about who progresses at the bar onto a judicial appointment. So these are, I think, useful questions. The question about representation and Asian Australians, and I'm using that term because I've just come back from a course I did at Harvard, and while I was there, of course, Harvard has a massive piece of litigation going on at the moment that you might be aware of, where it's under fire in relation to its admission procedures, in that it's, of course, been said that it's discriminating against Asian Americans, which is a very interesting piece. About 43% of all the applications that come into Harvard are from Asian Americans, yet the proportion who actually make it to Harvard is considerably smaller. And so there's some very interesting conversations there around diversity and around who gets in and who gets out of universities, which I think we haven't even begun to consider in Australia, and which may become more relevant with the demise of funding for university places and different arrangements, I think, being entered into in terms of how students get to university in Australia.
I think that is a fantastic place to stop. Can I just say that I think the last discussion we've been having here again reinforces the importance of what Amat and our colleagues at Affinity do here, because we are a society that is still very divided and very much dominated by particular genders and groups. Without sessions like we've had today, we're not going to progress. And I agree, progression in this area is always going to be painfully slow. But with people of goodwill and with an understanding of who we are and what we're doing, then we can hope to make some progress. It used to be that even being Italian and Greek in Australia was really, really difficult. I think they have progressed somewhat. Asian Australians, I think, finally are beginning to get a voice as well, but it takes time. And for me, it's hugely encouraging to see that progress. Just the ABC in recent times has run this program called Back in Time for Dinner. I don't know if you've seen that, but if you watch that, you can just see how much Australia has changed in my lifetime, and certainly in my parents' lifetime. It's extraordinary. So it's easy to get discouraged, but if you look back and see where we've come from, we have come a long way. And I think that going forward, the statistics for engagement in law exactly mirror the statistics for diversity in Australia. And that, for me, is hugely encouraging. Law has always been a profession for advancement, there's no doubt about that. But 27% of Australians are either born overseas or have a parent born overseas. So it is our future. This is our future. So now I believe I have one further role to play, and that is to get you all to thank our speakers. And I'm going to call, if I may, Mary Karras, who's the Chief Executive of the Ethnic Communities Council of New South Wales. And this is a tremendous tradition we have here, guys. And I would like to get you to present our gift from...
Oh, it's just beautiful.
Amat's cousin.
Thanks, Amat's cousin.
To Tania.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Now, here we go.
That's
There we go.
lovely. Thanks very much, Amat.
Nice.
Just beautiful.
Fantastic.
Thank you. It is beautiful.
Thank you.
What did you do to your...
And now if I may call Dr. Patricia Jennings, who's President of the United Nations Association of Australia, to present a gift to Professor Michael Quinlan. There we go. Ahmad? Oh, you need Ahmad in here too. There we go. There we go. There you go. 1, 2. Very nice. Excellent.